Get you some analysis on that decision in the Constitutional Court. Joining us is Nkululeko Tselane. He's legal director at the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa, and Sanet Solomon, who is a political analyst at Unisa. To both of our guests, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. It's great to be in your company. Sanet, let's kick the conversation off with you. A massive decision by all accounts in the Constitutional Court, and one that was unanimous.
I think that it was really surprising. I think while a lot of people were wondering whether it would go the other way, I think that most analysts, and I would also argue legal experts, possibly have anticipated this moment.
What's your take, Nkululeko?
Thank you, Michelle. Look, it is interesting. It is interesting that it was a unanimous decision, but it was somewhat predictable. Initially, when we spoke about the impact of the Electoral Court's previous decisions in the way that it interprets Section 47(1)(e). So we knew that the Electoral Court was going to probably rule in the way it did, and then same as the Constitutional Court would probably rule in the way it did. But it was interesting that it was a unanimous judgment, considering that even the Electoral Court had 3 judgments.
Yeah, absolutely. Sanet, there's a lot of discussion now around the fact that, this does open up or rather highlight the need for certain aspects of the Constitution to be reviewed. Do you see it that way as well?
I think so. I think, firstly, I would say that South Africa has an amazing constitution, but as with other constitutions, there will be slight amendments that need to be made over time. And I think that while we have an amazing constitution, we are no different from other countries in that instance, yes. So I think that this is actually a great opportunity because it does show us slight loopholes in terms of our constitutions. And while some may view it as something negative, I actually think that it is something exciting, that we live in a country where we actually can participate in such engagement and that it will usher us into a different future going forward.
Also, perhaps the need, Nkululeko, for some introspection on behalf of the Electoral Court. I imagine this is a blow, having the Constitutional Court set aside a decision by the Electoral Court.
Well, it's not necessarily a blow because, the reasoning, the Constitutional Court, the Electoral Court was pretty clear in its reasoning, as much as we could disagree. But there's also been multiple other courts that have made decisions that we've disagreed with, and then it's been taken to a higher court and it's been dismissed. What we must also remember is that on all the other matters, the Electoral Court was right, and the Constitutional Court upheld those judgments. So it's not necessarily a knock on the Electoral Court. I think it's just the nature of our democracy and of our courts that these avenues can be fully explored. I think perhaps just to add on one other point is that what I do find interesting about this, and as I had initially criticized it, that there was no urgency, you'll notice that even now, this outcome actually has no impact, has no electoral impact. As we know, international voters have already started voting, and of course now their votes were not tainted. So I think this also just confirms that point.
Yeah. Sanet, it takes me back to when the case was being argued at the Electoral Court, and in the words of Advocate Tembeka Nkukaitobi SC, the direct quote from his very short, very succinct presentation at the time was, "Lawbreakers cannot be lawmakers." I suppose he feels vindicated this afternoon.
I think that was quite fascinating. But again, I think this is one of those instances where we do see the rules actually being upheld. And it's also an instance to show that the IEC was quite right in terms of its initial interpretation of the rules. You can only interpret rules as they are. If something is stated directly as something else, you can't have your own implicit meanings in terms of the law. And I think this is one of those instances where we could say that is the case. But I also think just differently on a political level, I do think that this will have interesting political ramifications while it does not necessarily have legal ramifications for the country.
I want to get back to the political ramifications in just a short while, but I want to stay with, when we were first in the Electoral Court and these issues were being argued, Nkululeko, and, there was this discussion around what qualifies as a sentence? How do we interpret this rule around 5 years having lapsed since not only the completion of your sentence, as in when you came out of jail or when you received a remission of sentence, but actually the entire sentence itself, as it was given originally? It really does now, the victory for MK at the time was a hollow one, which was what a lot of people thought at the time. I don't know whether you agreed with that, Nkululeko.
Well, in hindsight, you could say it was a hollow victory, but at the time, I don't think it was, because they were obviously exercising their powers and they got the outcome that they wanted to at the time. But as we look at it now, unfortunately, they did lose. There was an interesting comment that was made by Mr. Tembeka and Chaitobi, in that serious lawbreakers can't be lawmakers, like you just mentioned. But what's actually interesting about that quote is that it's actually incorrect, because serious lawbreakers can be lawmakers. However, they just have to wait 5 years after serving their sentence. So those are some of the other things that people have also mentioned that they would perhaps want to see amended in the Constitution. Perhaps there shouldn't be a 5-year waiting period at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to, whether we need serious introspection about the rules as the legislation as it stands. So, Sanet, let's talk political ramifications this afternoon. What does this mean for MK, the fact that really the face of the party, no matter how you spin it, former President Jacob Zuma, will not be going to Parliament?
I think that they've made a series of mistakes. I would think that the dismissal of the founder in this instance is now a problem, because if the former president had worked and collaborated with Mr. Khumalo, at least the political party would be able to move forward, especially after all of these legal challenges are now finalized. So that's the first thing. Secondly, a lot of the hype was because the former president was the leader of the political party, and now with him not being able to contest for the political party, that obviously puts a spanner in the works. And thirdly, you had Khumalo's following or constituency that may probably go follow somewhere else. But this also raises an interesting question in terms of whether or not he could be brought back and whether or not they could try to salvage this, especially given that we have less than 2 weeks going into the elections. I think that also we've seen quite a number of rallies, while they've not been extensively covered, but we've seen a number of rallies, especially over this weekend and over the past week, where you've had MK support grow and so on. So I think that those supporters may be, one, either disgruntled, secondly, they may be disheartened and actually not show up to the polls, or thirdly, they may have to look for other alternatives. And I think this is an opportunity for other political parties to then come to the front and actually try to gather that support and try to integrate those people into their midst, given the fact that the initial support for the political party was based on the support for the former president.
Yeah, and I wonder what this does for those projections that put MK at 8 or 9% for these election outcomes.
I think that it's quite interesting. I think that a lot of it had to do with, obviously, personality politics. I think a lot of it had to do with his attraction. I know there was quite a number of polls also checking the popularity of the different leaders that were participating. And we would note that, for example, former President Mbeki polled as someone who people trusted a lot. Then you had the current ANC president, President Ramaphosa, and Jacob Zuma polling at the exact same number. You had John Steenhuisen and others polling slightly below them. And I think in terms of all of that, it's now obviously a changed dynamic, because it now means that those people may have to find an alternative political home. Instead, unless they would say, for example, the former president's daughter then becomes head of the political party, I think that would be a fascinating development, because it would also bring in to account the possibility of having a possible female leader in terms of another political party.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly one of the more interesting elections any of us will have covered. Nkululeko, also interesting times for an institution like the Election Management Services in Africa to be learning on the go, to be discussing all of these important issues, and to be looking at, how things might change in future elections.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I think we'll see. I think all of this litigation also really adds to the wealth of knowledge that election practitioners like myself will be drawing upon and really looking at what we know are going to be landmark elections with all the changes that are happening with independent candidates. And I think especially with this year being having so many elections throughout the continent and the world. So, this all really adds positively to that collective knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.